"The cleaner's son knows how to play piano," shouted the Millionaire CEO, Rodrigo, to impress his partners. He humiliated Sonia, the cleaner, and challenged her teenage son, Gabriel, to play the grand piano in the middle of the company party. The boy silently sat at the piano and began playing a Chopin masterpiece with a perfection that shocked everyone. Then, the world-famous conductor, the guest of honor at the party, stood up pale, walked to the stage, and knelt in front of the boy, and what he said next ruined the Millionaire. The air in the main hall of Sterlingthorne Capital was thick, heavy with the scent of expensive perfume and the power that money exudes. Crystal chandeliers, like captive constellations, poured a golden light onto the marble floor. So polished, it reflected the ornate ceiling with an almost liquid clarity. It was the height of celebration, an event meticulously orchestrated to massage a single ego, that of Richard Sterling. The multimillionaire CEO whose fortune was built on the volatility of the stock market and the kind of audacious investments few had the nerve to make. He moved through the hall not as a host, but as a king in his court, each handshake a concession, each smile a tool of power. His goal tonight was clear and bold, to seal a sponsorship with the legendary Maestro Antonelli, a man whose approval would mean more than any profit or dividend. It would mean consecration, the transformation of his vast wealth into a cultural legacy. As New York City's elite circulated, trading business secrets and discussing the future of their portfolios, Sonia and her son, Gabriel, moved in the shadows. They were ghostly presences, wearing discreet uniforms that made them part of the furniture. With a cloth in one hand and a bucket in the other, Sonia cleaned a champagne spill here, a crumb of canapé there. With a silent efficiency she had perfected over years of invisibility. Gabriel, a 16-year-old with slight shoulders and eyes that seemed to hold ancient secrets, followed her, his reluctance to be there a palpable cloud around him. For Sonia, this job was the guarantee of food on the table, of her son's schooling, of a possible dignity. For Gabriel, it was a constant reminder of the chasm that separated them from this world of wealth and opportunity. In a rare moment of calm, as the guests focused on a laudatory speech about Richard's financial genius, Gabriel stopped. His eyes, previously fixed on the floor, were drawn irresistibly to the stage. There, under the light of a solitary spotlight, rested the centerpiece of the hall, a Steinway & Sons grand piano, its polished black wood gleaming like an onyx mirror. It wasn't just an instrument, it was a promise, a portal to another universe. Gabriel stood motionless, his breath caught in his throat, his soul momentarily transported far from the smell of cleaning products and the silent humiliation of his station. He imagined the weight of the keys under his fingers, the vibration of the strings, the cascade of notes that could be born from that sleeping giant. The scene, however, did not go unnoticed. Richard, bored with the praises he already knew by heart, swept the room with a predator's gaze and saw the boy. He saw the admiration, the reverence, and in his cruel mind, an opportunity for a different kind of entertainment was born. He raised his hand, silencing the speaker mid-sentence. The murmuring ceased. An uncomfortable silence fell over the hall. "What's the matter, kid? Like the toy?" Richard's voice boomed, loud and laden with scorn. 200 pairs of eyes turned, first to the CEO, then to the dark corner where Sonia and Gabriel stood. The blood drained from Sonia's face, while Gabriel flushed violently, the heat of shame rising up his neck. Richard smiled, delighted with the effect. "What? The janitor's kid knows how to play piano. Come on, get up there, play a note for us. If you even know which one is which. Ha ha!" Cruel, muffled laughter rippled through the crowd. Sonia grabbed Gabriel's arm, a desperate, protective gesture. "Sir, please, I'm so sorry. We were just leaving," she whispered, her voice trembling. But Richard wasn't finished. He savored the power, the ability to control someone's fate with a single sentence. "I didn't ask for an apology, I gave an order," he snarled, the smile vanishing. "Either he gets on that stage now, or your mother is out on the street tomorrow morning." The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. Sonia froze, terror paralyzing her. She looked at her son, whose eyes now shone with an emotion she couldn't decipher. It wasn't fear nor anger. It was something else. To her absolute shock and that of everyone in the room, Gabriel gently pulled free from her grasp. With a quiet dignity that belied his slumped shoulders and simple clothes, he turned and began to walk toward the stage. Each step was deliberate, echoing in the deathly silence that had taken over Richard Sterling's empire of glass and marble. The boy did not look back, only at the black giant that awaited him under the lights. The silence that fell over the Sterlingthorne Capitol Hall was a living, breathing entity. It was a different silence from the one that precedes a speech or a performance. It was a heavy vacuum, filled with 100 held breaths by the weight of eyes fixed on a single, frail figure. Every step Gabriel took on the polished marble was a detonation in the quiet. The click of his worn shoes was the only soundtrack to this walk that seemed to stretch into eternity. For Sonia, each step was a needle piercing her heart. She wanted to scream, to run, to tear her son from that sacrificial stage, but her feet were nailed to the floor, heavy as lead. Her lips trembled in a silent prayer, not for him to play well, but for this torment to end quickly, for the humiliation to be brief so they could disappear into the night, taking the broken pieces of their dignity with them. She saw her son straight back and didn't recognize the posture. Where was the hunched-over boy who always tried to make himself small, invisible? Across the room, Richard Sterling crossed his arms, a smirk of superiority plastered on his face. He reveled in the scene. This was power in its purest form. It wasn't just about his vast fortune, the millions in stocks that fluctuated on Wall Street, or his growing net worth. It was about the ability to bend reality to his will, to turn people into pawns in his private game. This little drama was a low-cost investment with an extremely high return for his ego. He anticipated the clumsy sounds, the cacophony of an amateur, and the laughter that would follow, solidifying his position at the top of the food chain. To him, Sonia and Gabriel weren't people. They were liabilities on his spreadsheet. Disposable items that served a purpose and nothing more. Seated in a velvet chair in the front row, Maestro Antonelli felt a wave of revulsion. The spectacle was grotesque, a vulgar display by a man whose capital far exceeded his class. He pitied the boy, an innocent victim in the arena of a bored billionaire. He was ready to stand up and leave, to withdraw his presence from this circus of cruelty. Yet, something made him hesitate. There was a strange absence of panic in the boy's posture. It was not the resignation of a victim, but a focused calm, an almost frightening concentration. Antonelli, a master at reading the body language of musicians, saw something that didn't fit, an economy of movement, an alignment of the body that spoke of discipline, not fear. Gabriel reached the piano. He did not look at the audience, not at Richard, not even at his mother. His eyes were fixed on the instrument as if it were the only real object in the entire universe. With a delicacy that contrasted brutally with the tension in the room, he ran his fingertips over the polished wood of the lid, a gesture of affection, of recognition. He sat on the bench, not awkwardly, but with a fluid, precise movement, adjusting the height with a professional care that made one of Maestro Antonelli's eyebrows arch. For a long moment, he just sat there, his hands hovering over the keyboard, his eyes closed. The outside world, with its whispers and stares, disappeared. The hall, Richard, his mother's fear, it all dissolved into a distant hum. All that remained was him and the 88 keys, a universe of possibilities beneath his fingers. They were the same keys he dreamed of every night, the keys he played on a cardboard drawing on his bed, the keys whose sound he built in his mind, note by note, harmony by harmony. He took a deep breath, a single inhale that seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. Then his fingers descended. It was not a single hesitant note. It was a chord, a powerful, dissonant, and complex chord that exploded into the silence like a thunderclap, filled with a pain and fury that made the crystal glasses vibrate dangerously on their tables. That sound did not belong to an amateur. It belonged to a soul that had something to say. The opening chord did not dissipate. It hung in the air, vibrating with a promise of chaos and beauty, before being swallowed by the torrent that followed. Without the slightest pause, Gabriel's fingers, which Sonia only knew to be stained with bicycle grease or holding a pencil, transformed into blurs across the ivory and ebony. He wasn't playing a lullaby or a simple melody to appease the crowd. He plunged headfirst into the heart of a musical storm, Chopin's Etude Op. 25, No. 11, better known as the Winter Wind. The piece was a treacherous mountain, a climb that broke the fingers and spirits of even the most seasoned pianists. But Gabriel attacked it not with the hesitation of a climber, but with the fury of the wind itself. The right hand unleashed a furious cascade of notes, a hailstorm of sound that whipped through the hall, while the left hammered out a majestic, somber melody, the tragic voice of the storm itself. The arrogance on Richard Sterling's face disintegrated. The smug smile froze, then melted into a mask of stunned disbelief. What was happening? This wasn't part of the script. The kid was supposed to be a joke, a disposable pawn for his entertainment. Instead, the pawn had become a queen, dominating the board with a force he could not comprehend. Every perfectly executed note was a slap in his face, a public dismantling of his authority, control of the situation. His most precious asset was slipping through his fingers like sand. For the first time that night, Richard felt small in his own empire, an unwelcome spectator at an event that now belonged entirely to the cleaning lady's son. This talent was capital he hadn't anticipated, a variable that messed up his entire equation of power and humiliation. Sonia, leaning against the cold wall, felt hot tears stream down her face, but they were not tears of shame. They were of an astonishment so profound it hurt. She knew Gabriel loved music. She knew about the old keyboard with yellowed and broken keys that he had found in the trash and fixed with duct tape, and on which he played for hours on end in the silence of his small room. She had heard the melodies that leaked from under the door, but they were distorted, muffled, limited by the precarious instrument. She had never, in her wildest dreams, imagined this, that power, that passion, that flawless technique. It was as if she had lived her whole life beside a sparrow, never knowing it was actually a dragon. A knot of pride and a new kind of fear formed in her throat. Pride for her boy, her silent giant, fear of what this revelation would bring to the fragile world she had fought so hard to build with so little money. In the front row, Maestro Antonelli leaned forward, his body tense, his wide eyes fixed on the boy's fingers. His initial skepticism had turned to shock, and the shock was now giving way to an ecstatic reverence. He wasn't just hearing the music, he was seeing it take shape. He saw the sonic architecture, the mathematical precision fused with a soul on fire. This was no imitation, no learned performance. It was a possession. The piano and the boy were a single being, breathing together, suffering together, triumphing together. He recognized the fury of the technique, but it was the pain in the melody that held him captive. It was the melancholy of a life unlived, the frustration of a caged genius, all being exorcised right there, note by note, for an audience of millionaires who would never know such depth of feeling. Antonelli felt a shiver run down his spine. This was not just a talent, it was a miracle. The music continued to build, to intensify, faster and more complex. Gabriel shook his head, his hair falling over his eyes, completely lost in his own world. a sonic universe where humiliation and poverty could not reach him. The hall, once a den of arrogance and whispers, was now a cathedral of silence. Everyone present, from the billionaire to the waiter, united in a state of collective trance. The piece neared its climax, a final, dizzying cascade of arpeggios that sounded like the universe itself unraveling into sound. Gabriel's fingers flew across the keyboard, an impossible blur to follow, pushing the instrument and himself to the absolute limit. The tension in the hall was unbearable, every person holding their breath, waiting for the final explosion, for the release the last note would bring. The final note resonated not as a period, but as an entire universe condensing into a single point of sound before vanishing into the ensuing silence. The echo hung in the air for a second that felt like a lifetime, heavy with the weight of everything that had been said without words. Gabriel remained motionless, his fingers still resting lightly on the keys, his head bowed, his chest heaving as the adrenaline and emotion receded, leaving him exhausted and strangely empty. The real world, with its stares and judgments, began to seep back into his consciousness, but the ringing in his ears was louder than any murmur that might come from the audience. For those 4 minutes, he had been free, he had been powerful, he had been himself. Now, the boy in the cleaning uniform was back, sitting on a velvet bench that didn't belong to him, before an instrument that was an unattainable dream. He slowly raised his head, not to face the crowd, but to look at his mother, a silent apology in his eyes for having frightened her, for having broken their most important rule, invisibility. No one clapped. The shock was a physical barrier, preventing hands from coming together. The faces in the audience were a tapestry of astonishment, confusion, and, in some cases, a newfound shame. They had laughed at this boy. They had prepared to mock his incompetence, and he had given them this, a performance that most of them would likely never see live with such proximity and power again. They didn't know how to react. Applause seemed trivial, a gesture inadequate for the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. The silence, therefore, stretched on, filled with a tension that was the opposite of the one that preceded the music. If before it was the tension of cruel expectation, now it was the tension of reverent awe. Sonia saw her son's gaze, and her heart broke and mended itself in the same instant. She took a step forward, instinctively, wanting to shield him from whatever came next. Richard Sterling was pale. The flush of anger had been replaced by a sickly pallor. The event, his night, his triumph, had been hijacked. The script had been torn up and burned before his eyes. He looked to Maestro Antonelli, searching for some kind of cue, some validation for his confusion, but the maestro was not looking at him. Antonelli's eyes were fixed on Gabriel with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The maestro's reaction was the only thing that mattered in that room, the true indicator of the value of what had happened, the sponsorship, the prestige, the real prize of the night. It all depended on that look, and the expression on the old master's face was something Richard had never seen before, a mixture of disbelief, admiration, and something that looked like recognition. It was then that Maestro Antonelli moved. He did not rise to applaud. He rose like a man who had just seen an apparition. With slow, deliberate steps, he moved around the front row chairs and climbed the few steps leading to the stage. The crowd held its collective breath. What was he going to do? Congratulate the boy? Offer him a job? Each of the maestro's steps on the wooden stage was like the blow of a gavel, sentencing the fate of the evening. He approached the piano, his gaze never wavering from Gabriel's face, who now stared back with a mixture of dread and curiosity. Antonelli stopped a few inches from the boy, his wrinkled face contorted by a powerful, indecipherable emotion. The silence in the hall was so absolute you could hear the electrical hum of the amplifiers. And then to the complete and utter shock of the entire financial and social elite of New York City, the great Maestro Antonelli, a living legend of classical music, a man revered by kings and presidents, knelt. He knelt on the hard stage floor in front of the cleaning lady's son, the boy who minutes before had been the object of everyone's scorn. The gesture was so unexpected, so subversive to the natural order of this universe of hierarchy and power, that an audible gasp swept through the audience. Richard felt the floor disappear from under his feet. This made no sense. None of this made any sense. "You," the maestro stammered, his normally resonant voice now choked, a frail whisper that barely crossed the space between them. "I don't believe it." He looked at Gabriel's hands, then back to his eyes, as if trying to reconcile the boy with the memory of the sound. 5 years ago, I saw a video, an anonymous video on YouTube. Gabriel felt a chill run down his spine. The air seemed to thin in his lungs. A boy playing a broken keyboard in a subway station in the outer boroughs. The maestro's voice trembled. "The subway phantom. I looked for you. I searched for you in every conservatory in the world, in every music school. It was you." The maestro's words were not a question. They were the key that unlocked a long-sealed vault inside Gabriel. The subway phantom. That name, an anonymous whisper on the internet, was a real ghost in his life. He remembered the biting cold of the subway platform at dawn, the donated keyboard he had found, with 2 dead keys and a tinny, out-of-tune sound. He played there not for show, but out of necessity, because the music in his head was too big for the small apartment, too big for the toy keyboard his mother had sacrificed so much to get him. He played with hunger, with a desperate urgency to release the melodies that haunted him, using the noise of the passing trains to muffle the sound and hide his secret. Someone had recorded him without his knowledge, and for a brief moment his phantom had an audience. Then fear consumed him, the fear of being discovered, of being ridiculed, of his passion being seen as an unacceptable presumption for a janitor's son. So he stopped, he hid, and now, 5 years later, the phantom had been found. Unable to speak, his throat tight with emotion, Gabriel just nodded, an almost imperceptible movement. The nod was enough. For Maestro Antonelli, it was like the confirmation of an impossible scientific theory. He stood up, his knees cracking with the effort, but his posture was that of a man who had been rejuvenated by decades. The look he gave Gabriel was no longer that of a hunter who had found his prey, but of a devotee before a sacred relic. The audience, sensing that the moment for reverent silence had passed, erupted in a sea of whispers. Cell phones were discreetly raised, recording the scene that would undoubtedly dominate the society columns and news sites the next day. The humiliation of Richard Sterling would be the topic of breakfast conversations in every office on Wall Street. Sonia watched it all from her corner, her body shaking uncontrollably. A new kind of panic seized her, colder and deeper than before. Before, she feared humiliation. Now, she feared hope. That man, the maestro, looked at her son as if he were made of gold. People like them didn't look at people like her and Gabriel that way unless they wanted something. And what they wanted, they usually took, regardless of the cost to others. She wanted to run, to pull Gabriel away from that stage, back to the safety of their small, anonymous world, where disappointments were familiar and manageable. This world of wealth and promises was a treacherous ocean, and she feared her son, who barely knew how to swim, would drown. It was then that the maestro turned. He completely ignored the whispers of the crowd, the presence of Gabriel beside him, and fixed his icy gaze on Richard, who remained petrified near the stage, his face a pale mask of fury and confusion. The host of the evening, the multimillionaire whose deals and investments were legendary, suddenly looked like an intruder at his own party. Antonelli's voice, when it came, was no longer the choked whisper from before. It was clear, cutting, and resonated with the weight of an authority that no amount of capital could buy. "Mr. Sterling," he said, and each syllable was a hammer blow. "I came here tonight to discuss a sponsorship to find the future of music, an investment, as you like to say." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle before he even spoke them. "And you, in your ignorance and arrogance, were using the future of music to clean your floors." The contempt in his voice was so palpable, the air seemed to freeze. Richard took a step back, as if he had been physically struck. "The sponsorship is cancelled," Antonelli declared. Then, without giving Richard a chance to respond, he turned back to Gabriel and placed a firm, protective hand on his shoulder. "Kid," he said, his voice now gentle and full of a promise that made Sonia's heart stop. "You don't have to hide anymore." He looked past the hall, past the city, as if seeing a horizon only he could perceive. "The Berlin Philharmonic is waiting for you." The words Berlin Philharmonic echoed in the hall, not as a proposal, but as a detonation. For most of those present, it was a name associated with almost mythical prestige, a pinnacle of world culture. For Gabriel, it was a sound from a distant planet, a combination of syllables his mind refused to process. Berlin, Philharmonic. They were concepts so far removed from his reality of crowded buses and overdue bills that they felt like a cruel hallucination. He looked at Maestro Antonelli's serious face, searching for any sign of mockery, but found only unwavering conviction. The maestro's hand on his shoulder was a real weight, an anchor tethering him to this impossible possibility. For the first time, a spark of hope dared to be born amidst his shock, a small, trembling and terrifying flame. What if it was true? What if there was a way out of the silence and the shadows? The thought was so dizzying he felt lightheaded. As hope blossomed in Gabriel, Sonia's panic morphed into pure terror. Berlin was not a promise, it was a threat. It was an abyss that would separate her from her son. A world of strangers where she couldn't protect him. She saw the light in Gabriel's eyes and felt as though she were losing him right there, on that stage. Her maternal instinct, the most powerful force in her life, screamed a single word: danger. This world of wealth and power gave nothing for free. There was always a price, always interest to be paid, and she suspected the payment would be her boy's soul. She had to get him out of there. Now, before Sonia could move, Richard Sterling finally found his voice. The pallor of his face was replaced by a red blotch of fury. Public humiliation was a toxin in his veins, and he needed to expel it. "What is this nonsense?" he growled, his voice low and dangerous. He took a step toward the stage, no longer a host, but a predator defending his territory. "This is my event, this is my employee, and this is her son." He spat the words, each possessive pronoun an attempt to reassert his dominion, to remind everyone that in that hall, everything and everyone was part of his assets. "You can't just come in here and—" "I can, and I have," Antonelli interrupted, the calm in his voice making Richard's fury seem even more impotent. "Talent has no owner, Mr. Sterling, and it certainly doesn't belong to someone who can't even recognize it." "Talent?" Richard laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "He's an employee. His job is to clean, not to put on a show. Sonia!" he yelled, ignoring the maestro and fixing his cold eyes on the woman huddled near the wall. "Control your son, or I swear the only place you'll find work in this city is on the street. Your income depends on my goodwill. Don't you forget that." The direct, brutal threat hit Sonia like a punch to the gut. Richard's goodwill was the fragile thread that held her life together. The rent, the food, Gabriel's future, it all depended on this job. The Berlin Philharmonic could wait, but rent was due next week. Fear, cold and absolute, won. She lunged forward, panic giving her a strength she didn't know she had. "Gabriel, we're leaving, now!" Her voice was a desperate whisper. She climbed the stage steps and grabbed her son's arm, pulling him with a feverish urgency, trying to pry him from the maestro's hand, from that dangerous promise. "Sir, please, we're sorry for the trouble. He didn't mean to." "We're leaving now." Gabriel looked at his mother, at the terror in her eyes, and his heart broke. All his life, the priority had been to protect her, not to cause her trouble, to be invisible. But looking at Maestro Antonelli, he saw a path he never knew existed. Two forces were pulling him in opposite directions. His mother's hand, familiar and safe, pulling him back to the life he knew, and the Maestro's promise, terrifying and magnificent, pushing him toward a future he barely dared to dream of. He was paralyzed, caught between duty and desire, between love and freedom. "Sonia," Richard's voice sounded again, now dangerously soft. "I don't think I was clear. If he leaves this hall with that man, I won't just fire you. I will make sure, using every cent of my net worth and every contact I have, that you never clean so much as a public restroom in New York City again. You and your son are going to learn what it means to defy me." Richard's threat hung in the air, no longer the bravado of a humiliated man, but the cold, calculated oath of a billionaire whose wealth gave him the power to rewrite people's lives. The hall, which moments before had been buzzing with whispers, returned to a sepulchral silence. Everyone there knew the reach of Richard Sterling's power. His business was a tangle of investments, stocks, and funds that stretched across every sector of the economy. His influence wasn't just financial, it was a web connecting politicians, judges, and business leaders. The threat wasn't empty, it was a social and economic death sentence. Sonia felt the blood run cold in her veins. She looked at Richard's hardened face and saw not just anger, but a cruel pleasure in his ability to inflict suffering. He was breaking her, piece by piece, using her love for her son as a hammer. The dream of Berlin turned to dust. There was no choice. Survival always came first. "Gabriel," she whispered, her voice broken by defeat. "Please, son, let's go." The tears she had been holding back now streamed freely, tracing paths of despair on her tired face. Her grip on his arm tightened, a desperate plea. Gabriel felt the tremor in his mother's hands and the surrender in her voice. The small flame of hope inside him flickered, nearly extinguished by the icy wave of reality. He looked at her face and saw a lifetime of sacrifice etched there. The sleepless nights, the hands chapped from heavy work, the constant worry, all for him. How could he, in good conscience, destroy the little she had in exchange for a selfish dream? The weight of guilt crushed him. The Berlin Philharmonic would have to remain an echo from a distant planet. His place was here, beside her, in the shadows. He lowered his head, a gesture of submission. He was about to give in, to pull away from the maestro's hand and follow his mother off that stage and back into invisibility, when a new voice cut through the silence. "I don't believe you'll be doing any of that, Mr. Sterling." The voice was female, calm, and carried a serene authority that contrasted with the explosive tension of the room. It came from a figure who, until now, had gone unnoticed. In the front row, next to Maestro Antonelli's now empty chair, a middle-aged woman with silver hair tied in an elegant bun and a dress of simple but undeniably expensive cut, stood up. It was Lucia Pereira, one of the minority partners at Sterling Thorne Capital. Known in financial circles for her discretion and her incredibly astute investment analyses, she rarely spoke at public events. Her specialty was the back channels, where she had quietly built a considerable fortune by investing in tech and cryptocurrencies long before they became mainstream. Richard turned to her, surprised and irritated by the interruption. "Lucia, stay out of this. This is an employee matter." "On the contrary, Richard," she replied, taking a step toward the stage, her gaze firm and unafraid. "This stopped being an employee matter the moment you decided to use Sterling Thorne Capital's name and resources to conduct a personal, unethical vendetta. This is now a business matter." Richard's jaw dropped. unethical. I'm the CEO. I decide what's best for the company's capital. And how, exactly, does turning this event, which cost a fortune in cash flow, into a spectacle of cruelty to destroy the life of an employee and her talented son generate a return for our shareholders? Lucia retorted, her voice still calm, but every word was a sharp needle. Our liabilities just increased exponentially. The damage to the company's image when the story of this abuse of power leaks, and it will leak, will be catastrophic. Your personal actions have just put the net worth of everyone in this room with money invested here at risk. A murmur of agreement rippled through the partners and investors present. Lucia had changed the game. She didn't appeal to morality or compassion. She spoke the only language Richard and everyone in that room understood perfectly: money. She turned to the audience. I, for one, do not intend to see the value of my shares plummet because of a whim of our CEO. I propose an emergency board vote, here and now, for a review of his leadership, and in the meantime, she turned back to Richard, her gaze as hard as steel. I would like to announce a personal investment. Sonia, she said, her voice suddenly gentle as she addressed the paralyzed woman on the stage. As of this moment, you no longer work for this man. You work for me. As my personal consultant, your salary will be double, and I will personally cover the travel and living expenses for both of you in Berlin for as long as it takes. Consider it part of the legacy I intend to leave for a world with more art and less arrogance. The echo of Lucia Pereira's offer, your salary will be double, cover the travel and living expenses for both of you in Berlin, reverberated in the stunned silence of the hall. For Sonia, the words weren't just sounds, they were solid objects. Too heavy for her mind to comprehend. Double the salary, Berlin. These were concepts from another life, from a parallel universe where suffering wasn't the currency. She looked at Lucia's face, a woman she barely knew, and saw a calm and a sincerity that terrified her even more than Richard's fury. Cruelty was familiar, a known terrain. Disinterested generosity, however, was a strange territory filled with traps she didn't know how to navigate. Panic and hope waged a violent battle in her chest, leaving her paralyzed, unable to breathe. Her hand still clamped on Gabriel's arm as if he were her only life raft in an ocean that was swallowing her whole. Her gaze sought her son's, and in it she saw a reflection of her own confusion, but also a flickering light she hadn't seen in years, the light of a dream that refused to die. The paralysis was broken by the sound of a laugh. It wasn't a laugh of joy, but an ugly, torn sound that ripped from Richard Sterling's throat. He was composing himself, the mask of fury being replaced by one of mocking contempt. How touching, Lucia! What a beautiful display of charity, he spat, sarcasm dripping from every word. Do you really think you can buy talent, or a life? He turned to Sonia and Gabriel, his gaze sweeping over them as if they were trash. Enjoy your handout, enjoy it while it lasts, but don't forget what you are. You will always depend on someone's goodwill. Yesterday, it was mine. Today, it's hers. You will never have anything that is truly your own. You'll always be a charity project, an exotic pet for the bored elite. One day, she'll get tired of her new toy too. That was the final blow. That poison, more than any threat of firing, was what finally broke something inside Sonia. Richard was no longer attacking her job. He was attacking her dignity, her son's dignity, the very value of their lives. He was trying to poison the one good thing that had happened to them, to stain it with the mark of shame. And suddenly, the fear that had paralyzed her for her entire life transformed into a smoldering ember of protective fury. An icy calm enveloped her. She let go of Gabriel's arm. She lifted her head and for the first time looked directly into Richard Sterling's eyes, not as a frightened employee, but as an equal. You're mistaken, she said. her voice low but so firm it cut through the air and silenced his mockery. "The one thing my son and I have, that you, with all your fortune and your assets, will never have, is each other, and that, Mr. Sterling, is priceless. It's not an asset you can buy or sell on the stock exchange." She then turned to Lucia, and in her eyes was a gratitude so immense and pure, it lit up her tired face. "Ms. Pereira, I don't know why you're doing this, but if your offer is still standing, we accept." Those two words, "we accept," were the true final note of the evening. They sealed Richard's fate and opened the universe for Gabriel. Maestro Antonelli, who had watched everything with a silent intensity, smiled for the first time, a genuine smile of relief and admiration. He approached Sonia and took her hand gently. "My dear woman, you are as strong as your son is talented. The world of music owes you a debt of gratitude." Lucia Pereira just nodded to Sonia, a gesture of mutual respect that transcended the barriers of class and capital that defined that hall. Gabriel looked at his mother, seeing her no longer as a fragile figure to be protected, but as the woman who had saved him, who had fought for his future with the only weapon she had, her voice. He took her other hand, lacing his fingers through hers. Together, the three of them, mother, son, and maestro, turned and, without looking back, began to descend the steps of the stage. The crowd instinctively parted to let them pass, the looks of mockery now replaced by an astonished respect. As they walked down the marble corridor toward the exit, Sonia and Gabriel were no longer cleaners slinking in the shadows. They were the center of the universe. For the first time in their lives, they were not invisible. The exit from the Sterling Thorne Capitol Hall was not an escape, but a procession. The night air of New York, usually heavy with pollution, felt surprisingly fresh and clean as the glass doors closed behind them, muffling the rising murmur of the shocked elite. The sound of distant traffic on Park Avenue was a mundane and comforting music after the almost unbearable tension inside. Sonia, Gabrielle, Maestro Antonelli, and Lucia Pereira stood on the sidewalk under the cool light of the street lamps, an unlikely group united by a moment that had shattered the natural order of their universe. Sonia was still trembling, the adrenaline of the confrontation beginning to dissipate, leaving a vacuum of uncertainty in its place. The reality of the decision she had made began to settle in, and the weight was overwhelming. What had she done? Rejected the only security she knew and thrown herself, along with her son, into the arms of strangers, however well-intentioned they seemed. Fear, an old companion, began to whisper in her ear again. Gabriel felt his mother's hand trembling in his and squeezed it tighter, trying to transmit a security he himself did not feel. His mind was a whirlwind. Berlin, the Philharmonic, Lucia Pereira. They were pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit into his worldview. He looked at Maestro Antonelli, whose face, under the streetlights, seemed older, the wrinkles deeper, but his eyes shone with a youthful energy. Then he looked at Lucia, whose calm expression was like a safe harbor in the middle of his internal storm. He felt like a character in a book that wasn't his, turning a page to a chapter he didn't know how to read. The joy of the music, the liberation he had felt at the piano, now seemed distant, overshadowed by the terrifying magnitude of its consequences. What came next, the life he knew, with its predictable routine of hardship, had been irrevocably destroyed. "I know this is all overwhelming," Lucia said, her gentle voice breaking the silence. She seemed to be reading their minds. "You don't have to decide anything tonight, but my offer is serious. Sonia, my driver, will take you home. Tomorrow, if you'll allow me, I'd like to visit you to talk calmly, away from all this." She made a vague gesture toward the towering building behind them, a gesture that dismissed not only the building but the entire world of superficial wealth and power it represented. "Maestro, would you give us the honor of your company tomorrow?" "It would be a pleasure," Antonelli replied promptly, his gaze still fixed on Gabriel, as if he feared the boy might disappear if he looked away. Gabriel, what you did today was more than play the piano. You reminded us that true wealth is not in possessions or assets, but in the human spirit. The world needs to hear what you have to say. A black luxury car pulled up silently beside them. The driver, a man in an impeccable uniform, got out and opened the rear door. Sonia hesitated. Getting into that car felt like a definitive step, a crossing of a border from which there would be no return. It was the first step away from her old life. Gabriel sensed her hesitation. "Mom," he said, his voice low and uncertain. Maybe we should listen. Just listen." The plea in his voice, the spark of hope he was trying to keep alive, was what convinced her. She took a deep breath, the smell of the car's leather interior mixing with the city air, and got in. Gabriel followed her. Before the door closed, Lucia leaned in. "Sonia," she said, and her gaze was direct and devoid of any pity, only genuine respect. "Richard was wrong. You are not a charity project. This is an investment. I'm an investor, and I have never, in my entire career, seen an asset with as much potential for return as your son's talent." The door closed. The car pulled away smoothly from the curb, gliding into the night. Through the rear window, Gabriel saw the figures of Lucia and the maestro shrinking, standing on the sidewalk like guardians of a new destiny. He leaned back against the soft seat, a sensation as strange and uncomfortable as everything else. The car was silent, insulating them from the city's noises, creating a bubble of unreality. Sonia stared straight ahead, her hands clasped in her lap, her mind racing. Had she traded the tyranny of one boss for the benevolence of another, or was this something different? The word Lucia had used, investment, spun in her head. She didn't fully understand it, but she felt it was the key to everything. They weren't a burden, they were an asset. An asset. The idea was so new, so revolutionary, that she didn't know whether it comforted her or frightened her even more. The drive home was wrapped in a dense silence, punctuated only by the soft hum of the luxury car's engine. For Gabrielle and Sonia, the journey that usually took over an hour on 2 crowded buses was covered in less than 30 minutes, cutting across the city as if the social and geographical barriers that defined their lives had been temporarily suspended. As they turned onto their street in the outer boroughs, the difference between the two worlds became brutally clear. Potholed asphalt replaced the wide avenues, and glass skyscrapers gave way to unfinished 2-story houses and small shops with their steel shutters down. The expensive car, gliding through the narrow streets, looked like a spaceship that had landed on an unknown planet. When it stopped in front of the simple building where they lived, the driver wished them a good night with professional courtesy, and they got out, feeling the familiar air and the sound of dogs barking in the distance. The bubble of unreality had burst. They were home. They climbed the 2 flights of stairs in silence. Inside the small apartment, everything was exactly as they had left it, but at the same time, nothing felt the same. The simple furniture, the small kitchen, the faded photos on the wall, it all seemed to belong to a life that was no longer theirs. Sonia walked to the window and looked out at the street, at the black car that was already departing, disappearing into the darkness. She felt like a stranger in her own home. What would happen tomorrow when Lucia Pereira and Maestro Antonelli arrived? How would they fit in her small living room? The idea was so absurd she almost laughed. A laugh that would have turned into a sob. She sat down at the kitchen table and buried her face in her hands. The weight of everything, the humiliation, the fury, the fear, the hope, finally crashing down on her. Gabriel watched his mother, his heart aching. He approached and, in a rare gesture, placed his hands on her shoulders. "It's going to be okay, Mom." Sonia looked up, her eyes red. How, Gabriel? How is it going to be okay? I don't understand any of this. That woman, the maestro. What do they want from you? People like them don't do things for free. There's always a price. What if the price is you? What if they take you away from me? Her voice broke, revealing the core of her deepest fear. Loss. They won't take me, Gabriel said, his voice surprisingly firm. We'll go together. Miss Lucia said so. Both of you. He knelt beside her, forcing her to look him in the eyes. Mom, for the first time in my life, I'm not scared. Up on that stage, playing that piano, I wasn't the janitor's son. I wasn't invisible. I was me, and I can't go back to hiding. I don't want to anymore. For the first time, Sonia saw the man her son was becoming. There was a strength in his eyes, a determination she had never seen before. Music was no longer just a hobby, a secret kept in a small room. It had become his voice, his identity, and she realized that trying to silence it now would be like trying to stop the sun from rising. It would be to deny the very essence of who he was, and that she could not do. The love that made her fear for him was the same love that now compelled her to let him fly. That same night, in a luxurious apartment on the other side of the city, Lucia Pereira was on the phone. Yes, it's all confirmed. The passports, the visas. I need everything expedited. Yes, it's a high-risk investment, but with a very high long-term return. Now see, it's not in stocks or some new crypto. It's in a much older and more reliable asset, human talent. Meanwhile, in his hotel room, Maestro Antonelli couldn't sleep. He was online, watching an old, grainy YouTube video. The image showed a thin boy in a poorly lit subway station, playing a broken keyboard with a fury and passion that the poor recording quality couldn't hide. The subway phantom. He smiled. The phantom finally had a name, and soon the whole world would know it. He closed the laptop and walked to the window, looking out at the sea of lights of New York. Down there, somewhere in that immense city, slept the future of music, and he, Antonelli, would have the honor of being its witness. The night was long for everyone, a bridge suspended between the past they had left behind and a future that was both terrifying and irresistibly bright. The next morning arrived not with the gentle softness of a new day, but with the urgency of a countdown. Sonia barely slept, haunted by a parade of nightmares and anxious fantasies. By 6 a.m., she was already up, moving through the apartment with a feverish energy. She cleaned what was already clean, straightened what was already in order. Every scrubbed object, every fluffed pillow was a desperate attempt to impose some control on a life that had spun completely off its axis. Gabriel watched her from his bedroom doorway, understanding that his mother's restlessness was a manifestation of her fear. He hadn't slept well either. The Chopin melody still echoed in his head, but now it was mixed with the voices of Richard, the maestro, and Lucia, a chaotic symphony of threats, promises, and expectations. The old, dusty keyboard in the corner of his room seemed to mock him, a humble reminder of his origins, so dissonant with the grandeur of the Berlin Philharmonic. What if it was all a mistake? What if Maestro Antonelli was wrong, and he was just the subway phantom, a raw talent incapable of being polished? Promptly at 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. The sound, normally banal, seemed like a gong announcing the start of a new act. Sonia wiped her sweaty palms on her apron, took a deep breath, and opened the door. Lucia Pereira and Maestro Antonelli stood in the modest hallway. They didn't look out of place. On the contrary, they brought with them an aura of calm that seemed to soften the tension in the air. Lucia wore linen trousers and a simple silk blouse, and the maestro wore a cashmere sweater over a collared shirt. They were the clothes of people whose wealth did not need to be announced. "Good morning, Sonia, Gabrielle. May we come in?" Lucia asked with a gentle smile. Sonia just nodded, stepping back to let them pass. The small living room seemed to shrink with their presence. The maestro looked around, not with invasive curiosity, but with the gaze of a historian trying to understand the context of a great work of art. His eyes landed on the keyboard leaning against the wall, and an understanding smile touched his lips. This is where the magic began. Lucia, for her part, sat in the simplest chair Sonia offered her, politely refusing the sofa, as if to minimize any discomfort. "I imagine you have many questions," Lucia began, getting straight to the point, but with a tone that invited conversation, not intimidation. "And I want you to know that there is no obligation. Your decision must be a free one." Sonia finally found her voice. "Ma'am, why are you doing this for us? We have nothing to offer you. We have no money, no assets." Lucia looked from Sonia to Gabriel, and her gaze was that of a strategist evaluating a promising deal. "Sonia, I'm going to be very frank. I am not a philanthropist. I am an investor. My business is to identify undervalued assets and invest in them before the rest of the market realizes their potential. I made my fortune investing in tech stocks and in Bitcoin when everyone thought it was madness. What I saw last night in Gabriel's talent is the clearest investment opportunity I have ever encountered. The emotional and cultural return, in this case, outweighs any financial profit. But for this asset to develop, it needs the right environment, the right capital, and the right support." She leaned forward. "My plan is not to simply send you to Berlin tomorrow. That would be a disaster. First, we will build your foundation here. Gabriel will have lessons with the best private tutors in New York. We will buy a real piano, and you, Sonia, will not be left behind. I want you to manage his career. You will take courses in management, in languages. You will be the guardian of his future, not just as a mother, but as a professional. I will provide the cash flow, the structure, but the day-to-day control will be yours." As Sonia tried to absorb the idea of being a manager, the maestro addressed Gabriel. "And I will be your mentor. We will work together, not just on technique, but on the soul of the music. What you have is rare, Gabriel. It is a gift. But a gift without discipline is like raw gold. It takes fire and pressure to turn it into a crown." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of these proposals settling over them. It was more than a ticket to Europe. It was a life plan, a complete restructuring of their existence. Lucia then took a leather folder from her bag and placed it on the small coffee table. "This is the first step," she said. "It's a contract, not to bind you, but to protect you, especially from people like Richard Sterling." With trembling hands, Sonia opened the folder. The language was complex, full of terms like trusts, investments, and net worth. But on the first page, one number stood out, referring to the initial value of Gabriel's educational fund and career insurance. A number with so many zeros that her mind refused to count them. It was a sum she couldn't earn in 1,000 lifetimes of work. That number, the materialization of that impossible promise, brought no relief. It brought a vertigo, a paralyzing fear of a responsibility so vast it felt more like a sentence than a blessing. The number printed on the paper seemed to vibrate, a sum of money so abstract it didn't connect to anything in Sonia's reality. They were just zeros on a page, but they represented a universe of expectations. She felt a wave of panic, a dizziness that threatened to overwhelm her. This was too much. It was too heavy a burden, a terrifying responsibility. She wasn't a manager, an administrator. She was a cleaning lady. How could she manage a fund with more money than she had ever seen in her life? How could she negotiate with renowned professors and international agents? The fear of failing, of squandering this unique opportunity and proving Richard Sterling right all along, suffocated her. Her eyes filled with tears and she pushed the folder away, the gesture abrupt and defensive. "I can't," she whispered, her voice choked, barely able to look at Lucia. "I don't know how to do this. I'll ruin everything. Mr. Sterling was right." We don't belong in this world. This is a mistake." Gabriel, who had been watching the scene in silence, felt his heart sink. His mother's hesitation was a reflection of his own deepest fears. Maybe they were dreaming too big. Maybe their place really was in the shadows, playing on broken keyboards when no one was watching. Doubt, like a weed, began to strangle the hope that had blossomed in his chest. He was about to agree with her, to apologize for the trouble and end this fantasy, when Maestro Antonelli stood up and walked slowly to the old keyboard in the corner of the room. He didn't say a word. He just sat on the fragile stool, which groaned under his weight, and looked at the yellowed, worn keys. With a reverent delicacy, he placed his fingers on them, and then he began to play. It wasn't a piece by Chopin or Beethoven. It was a simple, almost childlike melody. A lullaby Sonia hadn't heard in over a decade. The song she used to sing Gabriel to sleep when he was a small, sick, and frightened boy. The melody was flawed, interrupted by the two dead keys on the keyboard, but unmistakable. Sonia lifted her head, her eyes wide. The tears stopped falling. How did he know? How could he possibly know that intimate, private song? The maestro stopped playing and turned to her, his gaze gentle but piercing. "Sonia, many years ago, my mother, a woman who could neither read nor write, sold her only inheritance, a small gold brooch, to buy my first sheet of music. Everyone said she was crazy, that she was wasting her only asset on a fantasy. She didn't understand music, notes, clefs, but she understood one thing. She saw a light in me, and she did everything she could to protect that light." He stood up and walked over to her. "You don't need to understand trusts or contracts. You just need to keep doing what you've always done. Protect your son's light. The rest, Ms. Lucia and I, we are here to help. You are not alone. But the courage, Sonia, the courage to take the first step, that has to come from you." The maestro's words, coupled with the melody of her most cherished memory, were the key that finally unlocked the door of her prison of fear. The comparison wasn't about business or money. It was about a mother's love, and that she understood. She looked at Gabriel, and the image of the frightened boy she had soothed with that song merged with that of the powerful young man who had commanded the piano the night before. They were the same person, and he needed her. Not the scared cleaning lady, but the mother who would sell her last gold brooch without a second thought. A new determination hardened her spine. She took a deep breath, wiped the tears with the back of her hand, and pulled the folder back into her lap. She opened it to the first page and looked at the number that had terrified her before. Now, she no longer saw a burden. She saw a tool. She saw a weapon to protect her son's future. She raised her gaze and met Lucia Pereira's. Her voice, when she spoke, held no trace of hesitation. It was the voice of a lioness defending her cub, the voice of a manager taking control of her most precious asset. "All right," she said, with a simplicity that carried the weight of an irrevocable decision. "Where do we begin?" Sonia's words, "Where do we begin?" transformed the small living room into a command center for a new life. The change was immediate and overwhelming. In the weeks that followed, the apartment, once a quiet refuge, became a hub of activity. The first major event was the arrival of the piano. It wasn't a Steinway grand like the one in Richard's ballroom, but an upright Yamaha, new and gleaming, which barely fit in the room and instantly became the heart of the home. For Gabriel, it was as if the sun had decided to live with them. The melodies that had once lived confined in his mind could now be born into the real world, full and resonant. Under the tutelage of Maestro Antonelli, who visited 3 times a week, Gabriel's music began to transform. The raw fury of his talent gave way to a depth and nuance he didn't know he possessed. Each lesson was a deeper dive into the ocean of his own potential. While Gabriel dedicated himself to music, Sonia immersed herself in her own intensive training regimen. Lucia Pereira was true to her word. She hired tutors who came to the apartment to teach Sonia how to read contracts, manage a budget, and speak English. At first, she felt like a fraud, stumbling over terms like a cash flow and return on investment, but the same determination she used to leave a floor spotless, she now applied to her studies. She filled notebooks with notes, practiced English with phone apps late into the night, and read every document Lucia sent her, asking questions until every clause made sense. Slowly, a new confidence began to bloom. She realized that the intelligence and resilience life had taught her were, in themselves, valuable assets. The news of the Sterling Thorn miracle spread like wildfire through the financial market and the music world. Richard Sterling, in a desperate attempt at damage control, issued a statement claiming that the sponsorship of Gabriel was, in fact, a philanthropic initiative of his company, and that the misunderstanding had been resolved. No one believed it. Lucia Pereira, in a strategic move, used the negative publicity to force the board meeting she had proposed. Faced with the loss of investor confidence and the plummeting value of the company's stock, Richard was forced to take a prolonged sabbatical, a euphemism for his silent ousting. His empire of arrogance, built on fear, crumbled not with a bang, but with the sound of a Chopin piece. 6 months passed. The transformation in Sonia and Gabriel was visible. Gabriel was no longer the hunched-over boy trying to be invisible. Music had given him posture, a presence. Sonia, for her part, carried herself with a new authority. She was no longer defined by her uniform, but by her competence. The culmination of this first phase of their new life was a small recital, organized by Lucia and the maestro in the concert hall of a local conservatory. The audience was select: music critics, agents, and orchestra directors from around the world who had come drawn by the whispers about the new prodigy. Backstage, minutes before going on, panic hit Gabriel. The weight of expectation was crushing. What if he failed? What if the night at Sterling Thorn had been a fluke, a lightning strike that wouldn't happen twice? He turned to his mother, fear written all over his face. "Mom, I can't do it. They're all out there, waiting." Sonia, the woman who months earlier had trembled with fear in the same kind of situation, took her son's face in her hands. She didn't say, "It's going to be okay," or "You can do it." Instead, she looked into his eyes with an unshakable calm and said, "Son, look at me. You don't owe them anything. You don't have to prove anything. Just go out on that stage and play for you. Play your truth, like you did that night. The rest is just noise." She straightened the collar of his suit, a suit they had bought together with her first salary as a manager. "I'll be right here. And no matter what happens, when the last note sounds, I'll be clapping." Those words were the anchor he needed. He walked onto the stage, sat at the piano, and for a moment, the silence of the audience felt as heavy as the one in Richard's ballroom. But then he looked into the wings and saw his mother's nod. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and played the first note, and the music, once again, set him free. The recital was not a repeat of the explosion at Sterling Thorn. It was something much more profound. Gabriel played a program that he and Maestro Antonelli had meticulously chosen, a musical journey that told his story without a single word. It began with the melancholy of Bach, moved through the restrained passion of Beethoven, and culminated in the transcendent fury of Chopin. It wasn't just technique, it was testimony. Every note carried the echo of cold subway platforms, the pain of invisibility, the rage against injustice, and finally, the overwhelming joy of liberation. When the final note faded, there was a second of absolute silence, a sacred vacuum where the music still hung. And then the concert hall erupted. The applause wasn't just polite. It was a thunderous, visceral ovation from an audience that had not just heard a performance, but had witnessed a soul reveal itself. Backstage, Sonia cried, but this time the tears were of pure joy and pride. Lucia Pereira stood beside her with a serene smile, while Maestro Antonelli looked like a father watching his son's triumph. When Gabriel finally came off stage, flushed and breathless, Sonia hugged him with a force that lifted him off the ground. "You did it, my son. You did it," she whispered in his ear. In the days that followed, the offers came in like a flood. Invitations from Juilliard, the Moscow Conservatory, and the official confirmation from the Berlin Philharmonic. It was Sonia, now confident and sharp, who sat down with Lucia and the maestro to analyze each proposal, negotiating clauses and ensuring Gabriel's interests were always protected. They decided on Berlin, not just for the prestigious orchestra, but also for its special program for young artists, which offered a holistic, not just musical, development. A year after the night that changed everything, Sonia and Gabriel landed at Berlin-Brandenburg Airport. The crisp air of the European autumn was a stark contrast to the heat of New York. It was a new world, daunting in its vastness, but no longer terrifying. They were no longer refugees from poverty, but ambassadors of talent. Lucia had arranged for a comfortable apartment for them near the conservatory, and the transition, though challenging, was supported by a network that she and the maestro had built. Their story became a kind of quiet legend, an inspiring tale whispered in the corridors of concert halls and the boardrooms of corporations. Lucia Pereira used the story as a case study in her lectures on investing in human capital, redefining the concept of wealth for a new generation of business leaders. Richard Sterling never returned from his sabbatical, his name becoming a synonym for short-sighted arrogance, a reminder that the greatest asset can easily be wasted by a lack of vision. On a sunny afternoon in Berlin, Sonia sat at a cafe, reading a book in German, a language she was learning with fierce determination, while waiting for Gabriel to finish his class. She was no longer the woman who shrank in the shadows. She was a woman of the world, the manager of one of the most promising young pianists of her generation, a woman whose worth was no longer measured by what she cleaned, but by what she built. Gabriel arrived, his face lit with the excitement of his practice. He sat across from her, ordering a hot chocolate. "Mom," he said, his eyes shining, "the maestro told me today that my first concert with the Philharmonic will be in 6 months, and he wants me to play my own composition." Sonia smiled, her heart overflowing with a love so large it seemed too big for the world. She reached across the table and took his hand. His hands, which she once feared would be forever marked by grease and hardship, now created beauty the world longed to hear. They had not forgotten where they came from, but they were no longer prisoners of that past. They had learned that true wealth was not in dollars, euros, or Bitcoin, but in the courage to be who you are, the resilience to overcome adversity, and the unconditional investment in each other. The most precious sound in the universe was not that of a Steinway piano, but that of reclaimed dignity. And that was a music they would play together for the rest of their lives.